FDR, was he a far-left socialist or left-of-center liberal? Now, even while he was in office, FDR was called a socialist by conservative business leaders and industrialists. Now, to understand if Roosevelt was a socialist, you need to understand what is socialism. Now, according to the Oxford Language Dictionary, socialism is a political and economic theory of social organization which advocates that the means of production, distribution, and exchange should be owned or regulated by the community as a whole. Yeah, in this case, the community is basically the government. Now, the second half of this theory, in Marxist theory, it is a transitional social state between the overthrow of capitalism and the realization of communism. Yeah, that is a bloody overthrow of capitalism. Now, this is why I refer to socialism as commie-lite. More government regulation means less money for the people. Okay, it's been called democratic socialism, European socialism, and socialist democratic republics or social democratic system. The bottom line is government regulation and control over the means of production and wealth and redistribution. Alright, anyways, moving along. The opening paragraph of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's first inaugural address boldly proclaimed,
"And I am certain that on this day my fellow Americans expect that on my induction into the presidency I will address them with a candor and a decision which the present situation of our people impels. This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly. Nor need we shrink from honestly facing conditions in our country today. This great nation will endure as it has endured, will revive and will prosper. So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance. In every dark hour of our national life, a leadership of frankness and of vigor has met with that understanding and support of the people themselves, which is essential to victory. And I am convinced that you will again give that support to leadership in these critical days.
Now, well, on March 4th, 1933, the world was in the depths of a Great Depression. Roosevelt was sworn in as president at 12 noon, and what he faced was a crisis second only to Abraham Lincoln and the succession crisis of the Southern states in 1861. The American economy was in free fall. America's gold reserve was hemorrhaging. For the previous 30 days, the American public had been withdrawing all their money from the nation's banks. Foreclosures were reaching crisis level. The economic indicators between 1929 and 1932 showed the industrial output of the company had dropped 37%, unemployment had rose 25%, and foreign trade had dropped down to 35%. People started to believe that capitalism was a failure and communism was the answer. So, March 4th, 1933, when Roosevelt said, "This country calls for action and action now," he was issuing a call to arms. Roosevelt's philosophy was do something, anything, and if it didn't work, do something else. Now, in his inaugural address, Roosevelt explained very clearly what he was prepared to do and what he expected from Congress, and if Congress neglected its duty, what he would do.
I am prepared, under my constitutional duty, to recommend the measures that a stricken nation in the midst of a stricken world may require. these measures or such other measures as the Congress may build out of its experience and wisdom, I shall seek within my constitutional authority to bring to speedy adoption. But in the event that the Congress shall fail to take one of these two courses, in the event that the national emergency is still critical, I shall not evade the clear course of duty that will then confront me. I shall ask Congress for the one remaining instrument to meet the crisis: broad executive power to wage a war against the emergency as great as the power that would be given to me if we were in fact invaded by a foreign foe.
Okay, let's look at Roosevelt's first 100 days in office and the 15 pieces of legislation passed during that period, as well as the Revenue Act of 1935, and you be the judge as to whether or not he was a socialist. Now, the first major act of FDR was to order a bank holiday. Roosevelt issued Proclamation 2039, Bank Holiday, March 6 through 9, 1933, inclusive. That was the title. Now, therefore, I, Franklin D. Roosevelt, President of the United States of America, in view of such national emergency, and by virtue of the authority vested in me by said act, and in order to prevent the export, hoarding, or earmarking of gold, or silver coin, or bullion, or currency, do hereby proclaim, order, direct, and declare that from Monday, the 6th day of March, to Thursday, the 9th day of March, 1933, both dates inclusive, there shall be maintained and observed by all banking institutions and all branches thereof located in the United States of America, including the territories and insular possessions, a bank holiday, and that during said period all banking transactions shall be suspended. Basically, Roosevelt was able to order this extraordinary measure, citing his authority under the Act of October 6, 1917. This was more formally known as Trading with the Enemies Act of 1917. Now, this act gave a President of the United States the power to oversee or restrict any and all trade between the United States and enemies in times of war. Well, Roosevelt knew his proclamation was legally iffy, as they say. Now, to get around this pesky legal issue of whether or not he had the power to close all banks, Roosevelt sent the Emergency Banking Act to Congress on March 9, 1933. It was passed later that day in a flurry of activity. The new law allowed the 12 Federal Reserve banks to issue additional currency on good assets so that banks that reopened would be able to meet every legitimate call. Now, Roosevelt's next legislative success was the passage of the Cullen-Harris Act on March 16th. Now, this act modified the Volstead Act. It was now legal to brew and sell 3-2 beer and wine in the United States. And his campaign slogan, "Happy days are here again." Now, on October 5th, 1933, Prohibition ends with the ratification of the 21st Amendment. The noble experiment is over. The Economy Act of March 20th cut the salaries of federal workers and reduced benefit payments to veterans. Now, this was intended to reduce the federal deficit. He then had the Civilian Conservation Corps. This was issued on March 31st. Now, this was a voluntary program, work relief program, basically, that ran from 1933 to 1942 in the United States for unemployed, unmarried men ages 18 to 25, and they eventually expanded it 17 to 28. Now, the CCC was a major part of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal that...
At campfires throughout the country, members of the Civilian Conservation Corps were inspired by the stirring message from President Roosevelt.
Men of the Civilian Conservation Corps, in speaking to you tonight, I am thinking of you as a visible token of encouragement to the whole country. You are evidence that we are seeking to get away just as fast as we possibly can from the dole. to get away from free lodging houses, to get away from soup kitchens, because the government is paying you wages and maintaining you to do actual work. Work which is needed now and for the future. Work that will bring a definite financial, practical return to the people of the nation in the future. Through you, the nation will graduate a fine group of strong young men, clean living, trained to self-discipline, and above all, willing and proud to work for the joy of working. That, my friends, must be the new spirit of the American future. And you are the vanguard of that new spirit.
The CCC was designed to supply jobs for young men and to relieve families who had difficulty finding jobs during the Great Depression in the United States. His next act was the Federal Emergency Relief Act of May 12th. This act created new unskilled jobs in local and state government. Roosevelt did not want a direct cash payment program, which he called the dole. He believed it was psychologically more beneficial to the unemployed who wanted any sort of job and wanted to work for their self-esteem to be paid. This program was later taken over in 1935 by the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, and also part of the Social Security Administration. Next was the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, May 12th. Now, due to the overproduction and low price, the government decided to buy livestock for slaughter and pay farmers subsidies not to plant on parts of their land. The money for these subsidies were generated through an exclusive tax on companies which process farm products. Now, the Emergency Farm Mortgage Act of May 12th helped farmers refinance mortgages over a long time at below market interest rates and at regional national banks. This helped the farmers recover from the Dust Bowl, allegedly.
Last winter, under the leadership of President Roosevelt, Congress created the Tennessee Valley Authority to operate Muscle Shoals. We plan to salvage the wartime investment so that the plant shall no longer be a burden on the American taxpayer. We have just announced proposed rates, which after covering comparable expenses of private power enterprises, will provide electricity for homes and farms at a maximum rate of 3 cents and an average rate of 2 cents a kilowatt hour. Cheap power, however important, is but a part of the great project as it was conceived by President Roosevelt. The authority is directed and empowered to aid and to stimulate the planned development of vast natural resources and industries of this great region comprising 7 states: Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, North Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi, an area almost as large as England in which live 2 million men, women, and children. The methods which may be developed in the Tennessee Valley Authority for stimulating the natural resources of an area in an orderly way will doubtless be applied to other regions of our country.
Now, the Tennessee Valley Authority on May 18th, the TVA was proposed to be a power supply and a regional economic development agency that would work to help modernize the Tennessee Valley and harness the Tennessee River. Now, the economy and society prior to the TVA, that region of the country suffered from lack of infrastructure, and even more extensive poverty during the Great Depression struck that area than any other region in the nation. Now, the Security Act of May 27th, this established the Security and Exchange Commission, now the purpose of which was to require full disclosure by companies issuing stock about all material information that a reasonable shareholder would need in order to make up his or her mind about the potential for investment. Now, interestingly, the first chairman of the SEC was Joseph P. Kennedy, President Kennedy's father. Now, When asked why he would appoint Kennedy, Roosevelt allegedly replied, "You send a thief to catch a thief." Kennedy knew the ins and outs of the stock market and all the tricks of the trade. Now, he also did the abrogation of gold clause in public and private contracts on June 5th. Contracts could no longer require repayment be made in gold or in gold monetary equivalent at the value set in 1900. Then had the Homeowners Refinancing Act of June 13th. This provided mortgage assistance to homeowners or would-be homeowners by providing them with money or refinancing of the mortgage. Now, the Glass-Steagall Act, this was June 15th. This limited commercial bank security activities and affiliations between commercial banks and security firms. In other words, commercial banking and investment banking had to be separate. Now, this act also created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. We know it as the FDIC. This insured bank deposits up to $2,500 if a bank failed. Today, that amount is up to $250,000. So don't put your money in a bank that does not have that sticker on the door saying FDIC. We also have the Farm Credit Act of June 15th. This established the Farm Credit System. Now, as a group of cooperative lending institutions to provide short and intermediate and long-term loans for agricultural purposes. The Emergency Railroad Transportation Act of June 15th. In order to foster and protect interstate commerce in relation to railroad transportation by preventing and relieving obstructions and burdens thereon resulting from present acute economic emergency, and in order to safeguard and maintain an adequate national system of transportation, there is hereby created the Office of Federal Coordinator of Transportation. Now today, this is a cabinet position, and we call that position Secretary of Transportation. The National Industrial Recovery Act, June 16th. Now, this was the NRA, National Recovery Act, but it was divided into two programs. One was the Public Works Program, the other was the National Industrial Recovery Act. Now, the NRA agency was created to implement these programs. The NIRA was considered an albatross by most businesses. It allowed for the suspension of antitrust laws. Its fair competition codes were allowed for prices and wage fixing. The NIRA also called for industries to regulate themselves. And even though the NIRA encouraged the unionization of workers to seek better conditions, the effort to form unions became very disorganized. Now, the NRA as an agency had the power to push for voluntary agreements about working conditions and fixed prices. They drew up more than 500 fair practice codes for the industries. This is where the NRA went afoul of the Constitution. Now, the Competitive Rules Clause for the live poultry industry in New York City found the Schechter Brothers Poultry Company had violated the Live Poultry Code by, among other things, offering unfit chickens for sale and not offering a minimum wage to the workers. Now, the case worked its way up to the Supreme Court, where it was nicknamed the Sick Chicken Case. The website constitutionalcenter.org wrote, writing for the unanimous court, Chief Justice Charles M. Hughes invalidated the poultry industry regulation as an unconstitutional use of Congress's Commerce Clause powers because the chicken at issue were only being sold in interstate. The court also struck down the NIRA as an unconstitutional delegation of Congress's powers to the executive branch under what is known as the non-delegation doctrine. The court said that the NIRA gave the Roosevelt administration too much power to control the economy through the use of the fair practice codes. There were other New Deal legislation that was overturned by the court on the grounds that the legislation was unconstitutional, such as the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act. Now, in United States v. Butler, the court said the act was unconstitutional for levying this tax on the processors only to have it paid back to the farmers. In simple terms, it was illegal to tax one group, the processors, in order to pay the other group, the farmers. It was also unconstitutional based on the regulation that agriculture was deemed a state power. Now, due to the Supreme Court striking down of major pieces of New Deal legislation, FDR decided to increase the number of justices on the Supreme Court. Now, the ConstitutionCenter.org states the Judicial Procedure Reform Bill of 1937 would have allowed the President to appoint an additional justice for every sitting justice who is over 70 years of age. Roosevelt could add 6 of his own justices to the court. With 2 liberals already on the court bench, that would put the odds in FDR's favor. Now, in his Fireside chat, he stated,
We are under a Constitution, but the Constitution is what the judges say it is. The court, in addition to the proper use of its judicial functions, has improperly set itself up as a third house of the Congress, a super legislature, as one of the justices has called it, reading into the Constitution words and implications which are not there, and which were never intended to be there. We have, therefore, reached the point as a nation where we must take action to save the Constitution from the court, and the court from itself. We must find a way to take an appeal from the Supreme Court to the Constitution itself. We want a Supreme Court which will do justice under the Constitution and not over it. In our courts, we want a government of laws and not of men.
Now, the public reaction to Roosevelt's plan was not what he expected. The public and Congress turned on Roosevelt. Now, in the end, FDR's court-packing scheme failed. Now, one of the most controversial pieces of legislation Roosevelt signed into law was the Revenue Act of 1935. This law raised federal income tax on higher-level earners as well as corporations. They called it the Soak the Rich tax. Now, under this program, the government could take up to 75% of the highest earner's income. That's basically, at that time, $100 million or more. The bill was nicknamed, like I said, the Soak the Rich tax. He proposed the bill on June 19, 1935. He signed it into law on August 30th, 1935. Now, Roosevelt had ushered in the area of large centralized government during his New Deal. Now, many Americans loved him and were willing to accept a large federal bureaucracy to handle the problems of a large industrial society. But there were also many Americans who believed Roosevelt had too much power and gone too far, and he was a dictator trying to control all aspects of the economy and everyday life. That was the NIRA, for example. Now, you got to remember something. Roosevelt was the only president to be elected to the office of the president 4 times: 1932, 1936, 1940, and 1944. Now, Roosevelt served 12 years and 4 months. He died of a cerebral hemorrhage in April of 1945. Now, when Roosevelt was first elected to the office of the presidency, remember this, people born in the early 1920s were just children. When Roosevelt died, those same people were in their late teens and early 20s, spread all over the world fighting World War II. Now, for that generation, Roosevelt was the only president they had ever known. The fact that he served 12 years was enough for some people to think he was a dictator. Roosevelt's social programs were implemented with the approval of Congress. You have to remember that. And where he could do it, he issued executive orders. Now, he did pull the country to the left because Presidents Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, they believed in the laissez-faire form of government. Now, when it came to business and the economy, Roosevelt believed in a form of social welfare. Interestingly enough, Roosevelt was against the dole. Now, today, we call it welfare. When he issued the Federal Emergency Relief Act to create unskilled federal jobs, he realized how important it was for a person's self-esteem to have a job and provide for his or her family. That was later turned into the Works Progress Administration, and it was responsible for many of the federal projects throughout the country. And then the Civilian Conservation Corps, that took the young men off the streets, put them to work cutting logging roads, building public campsites on federal property, reforestation, and the electrification of the Tennessee Valley. To this day, people will argue about whether or not Roosevelt was a dictator or the savior of the country. Now, the answer to that question is not cut and dried. What is not in doubt is the fact that he did guide the country through the Great Depression. He gave people hope. Now, on the other hand, a re-examination of his New Deal policies seems to suggest that those policies might have actually prolonged the Depression. Now, that debate is ongoing. Roosevelt was commander-in-chief during World War II, the most destructive war in the history of mankind. It was because of his leadership during World War II that the United States became a world power. But it was also because of his leadership and his naivete about Joseph Stalin and the communist Russia that we entered into a Cold War that lasted for a half a century. Now, if you were alive during the Roosevelt administration, you either loved him and believed he was the savior of democracy, or you referred to him as a traitor to his class and that man in the White House. Now, whatever you think of Roosevelt, he was an astute politician and parliamentarian. He understood the workings of government. He understood how to use the media to sell his programs to the American people, and he knew how to cooperate across the aisle. My, how times have changed. Today, we have people representing us who don't even know how a bill becomes law or how many branches of government there are. I'm not kidding. Just look it up. Now, one elected representative even said the current president should just ignore a Supreme Court ruling. Yeah, that would cause a constitutional crisis. We gotta, guys, we really have to watch out who we vote for. What do you think? Was he far-left socialist or just that man in the White House? Leave your comments. It'd be interesting to read what you have to say. Okay, I hope you liked this video. Now, if you did, hit the thumbs up button, subscribe to my channel, ring the bell so you'll be notified when I post more videos. But most importantly, share this video with your friends. Thank you for watching.